Aisha Carter was a ghost in her own city. At least, that's how it felt sometimes. Being a Navy SEAL, the first black woman to hold such a title, came with its fair share of challenges. But no amount of combat training could prepare her for the war she fought daily, being judged by her skin before her actions. The streets of Atlanta were home, but they were also a battlefield of perception. She had spent years abroad, serving her country in silence, only to return and be seen as another faceless black woman. To some, she was a threat. To others, she was invisible. She had sacrificed everything for her country, blood, sweat, years of her life. And yet, the welcome home she received wasn't the hero's return she had imagined. The military uniform that once shielded her from scrutiny was replaced by civilian clothes, making her just another person walking the streets, a target for assumptions. Walking through the city, she often caught glimpses of news stories playing on restaurant TVs, broadcasting another incident of racial injustice. She had trained her mind to stay detached, to remain stoic, but deep down, it gnawed at her. How could she fight enemies overseas while her own people were fighting just to exist back home? Aisha had always believed in honor, in justice. It was why she had enlisted, why she had pushed herself harder than anyone else, why she had broken barriers. But here, outside the walls of the military, justice wasn't something enforced by rank and code. It was something that had to be fought for, again and again. Still, she tried to move through the world with quiet strength. She trained daily, preparing for her next assignment, but she knew that the battles she faced in uniform weren't the only ones that mattered. There was another war, a deeper war, playing out in the streets, in the systems, in the way people looked at her. And she was about to find herself in the middle of it. Aisha Johnson had spent her entire life proving people wrong. She wasn't just another statistic, not just another face lost in the sea of expectations placed upon black women. She was a warrior, a strategist, and one of the few black female Navy SEALs in history. After years of grueling training, countless missions in hostile territories, and enduring the unrelenting pressures of military life, she had earned her place among the elite. But today, back home in her own country, in a simple grocery store parking lot, she faced a different kind of battlefield. It started with the piercing sound of sirens behind her as she placed her grocery bags into the trunk of her car. She turned her head slightly, noticing the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the store's windows. A police cruiser screeched to a stop. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with a rigid stance and an air of authority stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His name tag read Officer Daniels. The look in his eyes wasn't just professional scrutiny. It was something more familiar, something Aisha had seen in various forms her entire life. "Ma'am, put your hands where I can see them," he ordered, his voice void of any emotion except suspicion. Aisha exhaled slowly, fighting back the initial wave of frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice measured, careful. Daniel's hand hovered over his holster. "We got a report of suspicious activity in the area. You fit the description." There it was, the same tired script. "Suspicious activity? I just came from the store," Aisha said, gesturing towards the plastic bags in her trunk. "What description are we talking about?" Daniel's eyes flickered with something between irritation and challenge. He took a step closer. Dark hoodie, black female, moving suspiciously. Aisha glanced down at herself. She was wearing a gray, athletic jacket and jeans. No hoodie, no suspicious movements. Just a woman minding her own business, buying groceries. "That's funny," she said, arms still raised. "Because that sounds less like a description and more like a default excuse." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle." Aisha knew this was the moment. The moment many black Americans had faced before her. The moment where compliance wasn't always protection. Where speaking up could be seen as aggression. Where her life, despite all her accomplishments, despite all her training, could still be reduced to a headline if this went the wrong way. But she wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just any black woman. Aisha was a warrior. And warriors don't cower. She slowly reached into her back pocket. Daniel stiffened. his hand instinctively gripping his weapon. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out her military ID and held it up for him to see. "Before you go any further," she said, her voice steady but commanding, "you should know exactly who you're dealing with." Daniels took the ID, his eyes scanning over the words. United States Navy, SEAL Team Member, Lieutenant Commander Aisha Johnson. For a second, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. The power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't the helpless suspect he thought he was dealing with. Aisha crossed her arms. "Now tell me, Officer Daniels, what happens next?" For a brief moment, silence hung between them. The flashing police lights painted the parking lot in streaks of red and blue, as if the entire world had stopped to witness this confrontation. Officer Daniels' grip on his belt tightened as his eyes darted between Aisha's face and the military ID in his hand. Aisha could see the conflict brewing in his expression. He hadn't expected this. He was used to a certain kind of power dynamic, the kind where his authority wasn't questioned. But now, standing before him wasn't just another citizen he could intimidate. This was a trained warrior, someone who had faced down real enemies in war zones far harsher than the streets of this quiet town. Daniels cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "This doesn't change the fact that you were acting suspiciously," he muttered, as if trying to hold on to the narrative he had crafted. Aisha exhaled sharply. She knew this game, knew how it played out for people who looked like her. She had seen the videos, read the headlines, watched families grieve over encounters that should never have turned violent. And yet, a part of her hesitated. This wasn't a battlefield. There were no enemies here, just ignorance, bias, and a deeply flawed system that had placed her in this position over and over again. She had spent years proving herself, breaking barriers, serving a country that still looked at her with suspicion. She could just let this go. She could comply, nod, allow Daniels to save face, and walk away. Maybe that would be the easier option, the safer option. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But why should she have to take the easier option? Why should she have to make herself smaller just to ease his discomfort? Still, the doubt gnawed at her. Would it even be worth it to push back? Would speaking up really change anything? Her training had taught her discipline, patience, strategy. And right now, her instincts told her that picking a fight here, in a dimly lit parking lot with no one else around, could escalate in a way she couldn't control. Maybe walking away was the smart move. Maybe staying silent would keep her safe. But then she heard a voice. Aisha. She turned to see an older black woman standing a few feet away, gripping a bag of groceries to her chest. Her eyes were wide with recognition and something else, fear. Not for herself, but for Aisha. Aisha knew that look. She had seen it on the faces of mothers, sisters, daughters. That silent plea, "Please don't make yourself a target." And that's when she realized staying silent wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been in this position before. Every black woman who had been dismissed, overlooked, and accused simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She couldn't just let this go. She straightened her shoulders, the weight of her hesitation lifting. "No," she said, locking eyes with Daniels. "This does change things." Aisha stood firm, her gaze locked onto Officer Daniels, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his authority. But even as she held her ground, she felt the tension in the air, the unspoken battle between what was right and what was expected. Then, a voice cut through the silence. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Aisha turned to see an older man approaching, his stride confident but calm. He was tall, with a weathered face that bore the marks of wisdom and experience. Dressed in a dark suit, he had the air of someone who had seen far too much but still carried himself with dignity. Officer Daniels' posture stiffened. "This is official police business, sir. I suggest you step back." The man didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge. Special Agent Thomas Carter, Department of Justice. Daniel's expression faltered for the first time. Aisha could see the mental calculation happening behind his eyes, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. Agent Carter turned to Aisha. his eyes studying her with the kind of understanding that only came from someone who had walked similar roads. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson, I presume?" Aisha nodded, surprised. "You know who I am?" Carter gave a slight smirk. "When you're one of the first black women to become a Navy SEAL, people take notice. Your reputation precedes you." He turned back to Daniels, his expression hardening. "And yet, somehow, you failed to recognize that you were profiling a decorated war hero." Daniels swallowed, his hand falling away from his belt. "Like I said, she fit the description." "Of what?" Carter interrupted, his voice sharp. "A law-abiding citizen buying groceries? Or a suspicious black woman who had the nerve to exist in public?" Daniels looked like he wanted to argue, but the weight of the moment held him back. The power dynamic had shifted once again, and this time he was outmatched. Aisha felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, frustration, and a lingering sense of exhaustion. How many times had this happened before? How many times would it happen again? Carter turned back to her, lowering his voice. "I know you don't need saving, Lieutenant, but I also know when a fight is worth picking. And this isn't just about you. It's about the next person who won't have the luxury of a badge or a uniform to remind them they matter." Aisha took a deep breath. He was right. "You have two options," Carter continued. "You can let this go, walk away, and let him write this off as a misunderstanding. Or," he pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it in her hand, "you can make sure this kind of thing stops happening to people who don't have a military ID to shield them." Aisha looked down at the card. DOJ, Civil Rights Division. A choice. A challenge. A call to something bigger than herself. She met Carter's gaze and nodded. "I think I know what I need to do." What would you do in her situation? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge perspectives, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Aisha stood in the parking lot, gripping the DOJ Civil Rights Division card in her hand. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. For years, she had fought battles overseas, navigating enemy lines, executing high-stakes missions, and operating in the shadows. But here, on American soil, she was facing a different kind of enemy, one that wasn't hiding in bunkers or plotting in war rooms. This enemy was woven into the very fabric of society. She looked at Special Agent Carter, who gave her a knowing nod before stepping back. The unspoken message was clear: the choice is yours. Officer Daniels, still standing by his patrol car, had lost the bravado he had wielded so confidently just minutes ago. His jaw was set, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But beneath the frustration, there was something else: fear. Not of Aisha herself, but of what she represented. A challenge to the status quo. A black woman who refused to be intimidated. Aisha took a deep breath. For a moment, she considered the easier path, walking away, letting it go, allowing Daniels to tell himself whatever story helped him sleep at night. After all, she wasn't looking for a fight. She had come home from war to find peace, to rest, to reconnect with a world outside of combat. But peace without justice wasn't peace at all. She turned back to Daniels, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady, "I want to file an official complaint." Daniels flinched, his shoulders squaring as if bracing for impact. "Now hold on." Carter stepped forward, cutting him off. "She has every right to do so. In fact, I'll make sure it goes directly to Internal Affairs." He gestured toward Aisha. "Let's go." Aisha followed Carter to his car, leaving Daniels standing in the lot, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. She knew what was coming: the retaliation, the whispered justifications, the system closing ranks to protect its own. But she also knew something else. She was prepared for it. As they drove toward the precinct, Carter glanced at her. "You know this won't be easy. Nothing worth fighting for ever is," she replied. Carter smirked. "You sound like someone who belongs in this fight." Aisha looked out the window at the city passing by. Maybe she had spent all those years in combat zones just to come back and fight a war that had never ended. Maybe this was the battle she was truly meant to fight. Aisha knew the battle had only just begun. Filing the complaint against Officer Daniels was the first move, but now the real fight was underway. A fight not against bullets and bombs, but against silence, bureaucracy, and resistance from a system designed to protect its own. The tests begin. The moment she stepped into the precinct with Special Agent Carter, she felt the weight of the officer's stares. Conversations quieted as she walked past. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. She knew this wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. This was about what she represented, a challenge to the unspoken rule that officers could operate with impunity, that no one had the right to question them, especially not a black woman. The sergeant on duty, a stocky man with graying hair, barely glanced up from his paperwork as she approached the desk. "Can I help you?" he asked in a tone that suggested he had already decided she was a nuisance. "I need to file a formal complaint against Officer Daniels for racial profiling and misconduct," Aisha said firmly. The sergeant sighed, setting his pen down. "You sure you want to do this, ma'am? These things have a way of dragging on." Aisha met his gaze, unblinking. "Yes, I'm sure." Carter placed his badge on the counter. "And I'll be ensuring that this complaint is taken seriously. The Department of Justice is watching." The sergeant's demeanor shifted immediately. He straightened, clearing his throat before pulling out the necessary forms. "Of course. Right this way." Allies emerge. As Aisha sat filling out the paperwork, she felt a presence beside her. A young black female officer leaned in slightly, pretending to shuffle through some files. "You're brave for doing this," she whispered. "Most people just let it go." Aisha glanced at her, noticing the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept looking over her shoulder. "What's your name?" "Officer Renee Parker." Aisha studied her for a moment. Parker wasn't just being polite. There was something deeper there. She was someone who had likely seen too much, who had stayed quiet for too long. "You ever thought about speaking up?" Aisha asked. Parker gave a bitter smile. "And risk my career? I'd be out of here so fast they wouldn't even let me clean out my locker." Aisha nodded, understanding all too well. Sometimes the fight finds you whether you want it to or not. Parker hesitated, then slid a piece of paper across the desk. "If you need anything, I'm here." Aisha took the paper. A private number. An unspoken alliance. The enemy strikes back. But not everyone in the station was so subtle. As she left the precinct, a group of officers stood near the entrance, watching her. One of them, a tall, bald man with a scar over his eyebrow, smirked. "You must think you're something special," he said. "Rolling in here with your fancy badge and military background, thinking you can tell us how to do our jobs." Aisha didn't stop walking. "I don't have to tell you how to do your jobs. I just have to remind you that you're accountable for how you do them." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You're making a lot of enemies, lady. Don't be surprised if things get difficult for you." Aisha paused at the door, glancing back. "Difficult." She took a step closer, her presence radiating quiet strength. "I've survived Navy SEAL training. I've operated behind enemy lines. I've faced men with guns pointed at my head. You think I'm scared of difficult?" The officer's smirk faltered, just for a second. Aisha turned and walked out, knowing full well this was far from over. She had just crossed into enemy territory, and the war had begun. Aisha had fought battles in foreign lands, but this was different. This wasn't a mission where she could rely on her SEAL training, where the objective was clear and the enemy was obvious. This was a war fought in whispers, in paperwork delays, in unseen forces working behind the scenes to silence her. She had already felt the pressure mounting. The day after she filed her complaint, she noticed a black unmarked car parked near her apartment. It wasn't there before. The same car followed her twice as she drove through town. Then came the calls, blocked numbers, silence on the other end. Then the line going dead. It was intimidation. Subtle but deliberate. Aisha had seen tactics like these before. Psychological warfare, meant to unnerve her, make her second-guess her decision. But she wasn't backing down. She had a meeting at the DOJ Civil Rights Division in 2 days, and the case against Officer Daniels was gaining attention. Special Agent Carter had called, letting her know that an internal affairs investigation had been formally opened. That was the good news. The bad news? Someone inside the police department was trying to bury it. A dangerous warning. That night, as she left the gym, a familiar voice called out to her from the shadows of the parking lot. Aisha. She turned to see Officer Renee Parker, the young officer who had secretly slipped her contact information at the station. But this time, Parker's face was tense, her eyes darting nervously around the lot. "We need to talk." "Now," Parker said in a low voice. Aisha nodded and led her to her car. Once inside, Parker wasted no time. "You don't know how deep this goes," Parker whispered. "I've been hearing things at the station. They're calling in favors, trying to get your complaint dismissed before it even reaches the review board." Aisha tensed. "Who's leading it?" "Sergeant Billings," Parker said. "And he's not alone. Daniels has friends in high places. They're pushing the narrative that you were hostile and resisting. They're even pulling surveillance footage to twist the story in their favor." Aisha exhaled slowly. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "They're scared," Parker continued. "They think if you win, it sets a precedent, that people will start holding them accountable. They'll do anything to stop you." Aisha studied her. "And you? Why are you telling me this?" Parker hesitated. "Because I'm tired of looking the other way. But if they find out I helped you, I'm done. I'll lose my badge." Aisha nodded, understanding the risk Parker was taking. "Then I'll make sure they don't find out." Parker handed her a flash drive. "This is everything I could get from the station's internal system. Reports, emails, evidence that they're manipulating the case. But you didn't get it from me." Aisha took the drive, gripping it tightly. "Understood." Parker gave a nervous glance around the lot, then slipped out of the car and disappeared into the night. Aisha sat there for a moment, staring at the drive in her hand. This was it, the proof she needed. The fight had just escalated, and now there was no turning back. Walking into the fire. The next morning, Aisha arrived at Special Agent Carter's office. She placed the flash drive on his desk. "What's this?" Carter asked, picking it up. "Evidence," Aisha said. "They're trying to erase my complaint before it ever sees daylight." Carter plugged the drive into his computer, scrolling through the files. His eyes darkened as he read the internal emails, the backdoor conversations. "This is bad," he muttered. Then he looked up at her. "But it's exactly what we need." Aisha leaned forward. "So what's next?" Carter's expression was grim. "Now, we go public. We take this to the media. We make it impossible for them to bury this." Aisha exhaled. She had trained for combat, but this was a different kind of war. One fought in courtrooms, headlines, and public opinion. She had spent years fighting for her country. Now, she had to fight against it to make it better. And she wasn't backing down. But this was the fight she hadn't trained for. Her decision to go public had sent shockwaves through the country. The interview went viral, sparking outrage, protests, and demands for police accountability. The evidence she exposed forced the Department of Justice to intervene, launching an official civil rights investigation into the precinct. And then the reward came. Not in the form of medals, not in praise, but in something much more powerful, justice. The fall of the corrupt. Within days of the investigation's launch, Sergeant Billings, the officer leading the cover-up, was suspended. More officers were placed on administrative leave, their involvement in the manipulation of evidence under scrutiny. And then the biggest blow. Officer Daniels, the man who had racially profiled Aisha in that parking lot, was officially terminated from the force. The police department issued a public statement calling the incident a failure in protocol and promising new measures for racial bias training. But Aisha knew the truth. They weren't changing because they wanted to. They were changing because they had no choice. The system had been forced to look in the mirror. And this time, it couldn't turn away. Aisha's choice. She could have walked away after that. The mission was complete. Justice had been served, the corrupt had fallen, and the world had seen the truth. But something inside her wouldn't let her. She thought back to Officer Parker, the young black cop who had risked her job to expose the truth. She thought about the people who had been silenced before they could ever reach this point, those who never got justice. The fight wasn't over. So when Special Agent Carter called her with an offer, she was ready. "I know you didn't ask for this," Carter said over the phone, "but we need people like you. People who won't back down. The DOJ wants you on board as a consultant for police reform cases. Real change from the inside out." Aisha looked at the city skyline from her apartment window. She had always been a warrior, and warriors don't stop when one battle is won. They keep going. She turned back to the phone and smiled. "When do I start?" And now the real work, the messy, complicated journey of reform, lay ahead. She traveled from precinct to precinct, city to city, delivering seminars on implicit bias, racial profiling, and community trust building. Some welcomed her message openly, seeing her as a force for genuine progress. But others greeted her presence with suspicion, hostility, even resentment. "Why should we listen to you?" one veteran officer challenged her openly at a seminar, his voice laced with skepticism. "You think one incident makes us all guilty?" Aisha met his stare without flinching. "I'm not here to accuse you," she said calmly. "I'm here to remind us all of the responsibility we carry. Accountability isn't about blame, it's about building trust." After sessions like these, she often felt drained, uncertain whether she truly made an impact. Sometimes officers approached her afterward, privately thanking her for speaking up, admitting they had never considered things from her perspective before. Other times, she faced hostility, resistance, even open threats. But there was progress, too slow but tangible. Officers began speaking up, breaking ranks from the old mentality. Communities started demanding transparency, encouraged by her bravery. Through it all, Special Agent Carter remained her strongest ally, offering guidance and support whenever she needed it most. Late one evening, after another exhausting training session, Carter found her in an empty conference room, reviewing notes. "You know," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her, "real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence." Aisha sighed deeply. "I just wonder sometimes if it's enough." Carter leaned forward, looking her squarely in the eye. "You've made people uncomfortable. That means you're making them think. And when people think, really think, change becomes possible." She let his words sink in, nodding slowly. "I just hope it's enough." "It will be," Carter assured her. "Keep going." Aisha stood, feeling renewed strength in her purpose. She'd faced enemies before, terrorists, insurgents, physical threats. But now, she was navigating something more complicated, more subtle. Yet somehow, this felt even more important. This was her road back, her return journey filled with determination, clarity, and resilience. And she wouldn't stop until she reached the destination. One quiet afternoon, months after Aisha had begun her relentless fight for justice, she sat outside her favorite coffee shop, sipping an iced latte and reflecting on the battles she'd fought, not just overseas, but right here at home. The warm sun felt comforting on her skin, a subtle reminder that even after the darkest storms, peace was possible. As she watched people pass by, she noticed a young girl cautiously approaching, holding tightly to her mother's hand. The girl, no more than 10, had wide, curious eyes, bright with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Excuse me," the girl said softly, stepping forward with determination. "You're Aisha Carter Johnson, right?" Aisha smiled gently, sensing the careful courage it took the young girl to speak up. "Yes, that's me." The girl took a deep breath, visibly gathering strength before continuing. "My name is Maya, and I just wanted to say thank you. My dad showed me your video. He says you're brave. He says you're fighting to make things better for people like us." Aisha leaned forward, deeply moved by the sincerity and vulnerability in the child's voice. "Thank you for coming to talk to me, Maya," she replied, noticing the name stitched on the girl's backpack. "Your words mean more than you know." Maya paused, her eyes filling slightly. "My brother, he wants to be a police officer someday. But lately he's been scared. He thinks because he's black, they won't let him join. Or that if he does join, they won't ever accept him." Aisha listened closely, seeing her own younger self mirrored in the girl's heartfelt concern. She recognized this fear, the fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or treated unfairly simply for existing. It was the same fear she'd felt many times herself, one she'd fought every day to overcome. She stood slowly and knelt down to Maya's eye level, placing a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. "You know something, Maya? When I was your brother's age, people told me I couldn't become a Navy SEAL. They said it was impossible, especially for someone who looked like me." Maya's eyes widened. "What did you do?" Aisha smiled warmly, memories flooding her mind. "I proved them wrong, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because sometimes the things worth doing are the hardest ones." Maya's gaze sharpened, hopeful yet uncertain. "But what if they don't let him in? What if it doesn't change?" Aisha gently squeezed her shoulder. "Then we make sure it does. People like you and your brother are exactly why I fight. And you know what? Someday, you both might be the ones to carry that fight forward." Maya smiled, determination sparkling in her young eyes. "Can I tell him that? Can I say I met you, and you said he could do it? Better yet," Aisha replied warmly, pulling out one of her cards and handing it to the girl. "Tell your brother I want to meet him. Maybe we can talk about it together." Maya stared at the card as if she'd just been handed a precious treasure. A smile slowly spread across her face, wide and confident. "Really?" Aisha nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Because this fight isn't just mine, it belongs to all of us." As Maya walked away, holding the card tightly in her hand, Aisha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had battered her, tested her, nearly broken her at times. But this was why she endured it all. To inspire, to build hope, and to make the path a little easier for the ones coming after her. In that moment, she felt reborn, resurrected from exhaustion, doubt, and frustration. A single conversation reminded her exactly why she had refused to stay silent. She returned to her seat, picking up her latte, now with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. The fight wasn't over, but her spirit was renewed, her mission clearer than ever before. And now, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Her journey had inspired others, young people like Maya and her brother, to step forward, to speak out, to dream without fear. The world was shifting, and she had helped move it. Months had passed since that fateful encounter in the parking lot. Aisha now stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, looking out at hundreds of faces, students, police officers, community leaders, veterans, and young activists, all gathered to hear her story. Behind her stood Special Agent Carter, Officer Parker, and, most importantly, Maya and her brother Marcus. They were no longer strangers. They had become part of her mission, symbols of why she continued to fight. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Aisha Johnson," she said firmly. "I served my country proudly as a Navy SEAL. But the hardest battle I ever fought wasn't overseas. It was right here at home." The audience listened intently, leaning forward, captivated by her sincerity, her strength, and the quiet passion with which she spoke. "For too long," she continued, "our country has looked away from the injustice within its own borders. For too long, people have stayed silent because silence felt safer. But silence never brought change. Silence never brought justice." She glanced at the front row, where Maya sat beside her older brother Marcus, who now proudly wore a t-shirt with the words "Future Officer" printed boldly across his chest. Maya smiled, giving Aisha a reassuring thumbs up. "This isn't about one incident. It's not just about what happened to me," Aisha said, her voice gaining power. "It's about Marcus, who dreams of serving his community, but wonders if he'll even get the chance. It's about Maya, who wants to live in a world where her brother doesn't have to fear the people sworn to protect him." Aisha took a deep breath, feeling the emotion ripple through the audience. "I fought back, not just for me, but for them. And for every single person who has faced injustice, discrimination, or prejudice and felt powerless. My uniform gave me strength, but the truth gave me power. The power to speak, the power to stand, and the power to change things." As the auditorium erupted in applause, she saw familiar faces: Special Agent Carter, smiling with pride; Officer Renee Parker, who had now taken the courageous step to speak openly about the systemic racism within her own precinct; and countless others who had stood by her side throughout her fight. Allies she never expected. Connections formed through shared struggles. Voices united by a common goal. When the applause finally quieted, Aisha leaned closer to the microphone. "My fight is far from over. But today, standing here, I promise you, I will never stop fighting. We will never stop fighting. Because justice isn't given, it's earned, demanded, and defended every day." A roar of applause erupted again, louder this time, echoing through the hall, powerful enough to shake the walls. As she stepped away from the podium, Maya and Marcus rushed toward her, wrapping their arms around her in a grateful embrace. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me hope." She smiled warmly at him, squeezing his shoulder gently. "You've given me purpose." In that moment, Aisha realized she had truly returned, not to the world she once knew, but to a new one she had helped shape. She had returned with something invaluable, an elixir of hope, courage, and the power to change hearts and minds. And she knew this was exactly the journey she had always been meant for. Would you stand and fight like Aisha? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you're inspired by stories of courage and resilience, make sure to subscribe.